Mark Miller, and we have a program underway at St. Luke's Lutheran Church in Cap. And Mark, not being from this area, kind of slipped through the initial look-see as to who was World War II, and we discovered he was, and so here we are interviewing Mark Miller, and we'll get into his background and try to go through some of his life experiences, including and focusing on Second World War. So initially, Mark, were you drafted or enlisted?
A combination. We tried to enlist. There were 3 of us, and they wouldn't accept because they were short on supplies, and they turned us down. So this sergeant said, if you really want to go, he said, go over to the draft board and sign up, and they'll consider you a volunteer. So that's what happened.
So it was a voluntary draft, I guess.
Yeah.
And did you go in for 2 years then, or for duration?
Went for the duration.
For the duration, so you didn't have any time limit on how long you would be in. Oh, at the time, let's get into your background as to where you were born and grew up.
I was born on a farm on Chestnut Ridge Road in Garrett County in 1922.
That's Garrett County, Maryland.
Yes.
In 1922.
And I lived on that farm and worked there until I went in the service.
What kind of a farm was it? Was it like a truck farm or a...
No, it was just anything.
Dairy?
Anything to survive.
Ah.
This was Depression times, and there wasn't very much money around. I remember we loaded potatoes on the truck for number 1 for 15 cents a hundredweight, and you drove cattle to the scale for 3 cents a pound.
3 cents a pound.
Yeah. Live weight.
Yeah, those were tough times back in the Depression, and growing up on the farm, at least you had some means of livelihood.
That's right.
People living in cities were just kind of destitute.
We never went hungry.
That's good.
In January of 1943.
January of 43. So the war was underway, but we certainly hadn't made the invasion yet into Europe. And I guess we didn't cover it, but you were in the Army.
Yes.
And initially, let's just go through the steps as you...
Basic training in Camp Pickett, Virginia. The 45th Infantry is down there. And
what was Camp Pickett near? Was it Southern Virginia?
No, kind of the middle, I think, but I cannot remember now.
There's an AP Hill in the middle, but I'm not familiar with Pickett. I don't think it exists any longer.
Oh, I'm sure it doesn't, no.
And so basic training was basic infantry training.
Yes.
And then after...
I shipped out of there to Camp Shenango here in Pennsylvania, which I think no longer exists either, I don't think.
I don't think so. But Shenango, I know there's a Shenango County.
Yeah. And then from there I went to Camp Shanks, New York.
And that was where Shanks, that doesn't exist either.
No, I'm sure it doesn't.
Do you know what part of New York that was?
Well, it had to be pretty close to the harbor because we went from there to board the Queen Mary.
Oh, okay. So it was near the city.
Yeah, it had to be.
So, and what, can you recall which month or when you boarded the Queen Mary?
Boarded, I think, the 1st of June, and we arrived in Scotland the 6th of June.
6th of June, and that would be 1943.
That's right. And they couldn't, the ship was too big to dock, they dropped anchor out in the Firth of Clyde and offloaded us on small boats.
And going back to your training then, after your basic training, did you train in a particular military occupational specialty, MOS, as we term it?
Nothing.
Or nothing? It was, you were just assigned to a unit and moved from place to place
Yeah.
until you were located near New York to deploy. And when you deployed, was there an organized unit you deployed with?
No.
No, it was just
I'm sure it was a replacement system.
a replacement, yes. And so then you eventually ended up in England.
When we went out of, when we were offloaded into Scotland, and then we went by train down to Liverpool, England.
Mm-hmm.
And we were posted in that British Army post called Seaforth Barracks.
Seaforth, S-E-A-F-O-R-T-H, I believe.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to note that at this time, a lot of the ocean liners were taken over by the military, and I think you kind of lucked out as opposed to going over on a troop ship to get onto the Queen Mary. But then you had to anchor. Since you couldn't anchor in Scotland, did they take you in by
They had small
little
boats.
small boats that took
Take
you
us
in?
over the shore.
Mhm.
We went from there to the train station.
And so upon arrival in England, were you assigned to a unit then, or were you still kind of in a replacement
Still
status?
replacement status, I would say. I was there about, I'd say about 5 months. And then I was shipped over to Bristol, England. And there I was assigned to a supply unit. We call it a medical warehouse. We received requisitions for battalion aid station, or regimental aid station, or even a field hospital. And it gave you a list of everything that was necessary. And it was our job to pack it, waterproof it, and ship it to whatever unit it was going to.
So these are orders or requisitions that came in from the fighting troops on the continent in Europe.
Well, they had not made the invasion at that point.
The invasion hadn't taken place, you're right.
This was
So
all-
this is all just internally
Oh, getting ready.
getting ready to go. And that's interesting. During the time before you moved to Bristol, were you training at that time as a unit, like?
Not really. They had a smaller operation, like I just discussed, in Liverpool, but we didn't do a lot.
But generally, there was a preparation going on in England at that time for the invasion.
Everything.
And so things were really heating up at the time.
Yeah.
Did you get to know English people then?
Yes, we were getting so many troops that they were running out of space. So some of us that had been over there for some time, they billeted us in English homes. And that went on for probably 2 or 3 months.
And when you were billeted in a home, was that you alone, or were
There was 2 or 3.
several?
I think there was 3 of us in the house that I was in. And of course, we ate at the mess hall, and but we slept in these homes.
That's interesting, as far as how acceptable were the English people
Well,
to
they
having
were
U.S. troops
I
there?
have the greatest respect for the English people. When the bombs fell, they got protected themselves the best way they could, but just as soon as that all cleared, they were right back to what they were doing. I have only admiration for them.
Yeah, that was a tough time for the British when the air raids were taking place. Were you close to any of those air raids?
Some of them, yes. Enough that you were glad that those shelters were around there.
So sirens would go up and you'd go to a shelter with the family, or then when you moved to Bristol, were you still in a similar situation, or?
It was more so there than even in Liverpool.
So just approximately how many times were these attacks, or how often did they take place, like on a daily basis?
Well, it was fairly often, but where we were in Bristol, there wasn't a lot of it. Not like it was in London, was taking the most of it.
Okay, then I think it's also interesting as far as your deployment goes. Could you kind of just fill us in on how that took place when you actually became a replacement? I had asked to transfer out and was refused. Is this like you wanted to get into the fighting?
Well, I wanted to get someplace else. And the Army had brought some people back from the front. This is now after D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these men were just not able to face any more of it. So they sent them back to England, and if 3 came in or 6 came in, then
It's kind of like an individual replacement.
had to go out. Yeah.
And it didn't matter at the time whether it was an infantryman you were replacing or
Didn't make any difference.
medic or whatever it might be.
So there were 3 of us that volunteered and went down to Southampton, and that's where we shipped out from.
What did you go across the channel in?
That was an old tub.
Old tub. Was it used during D-Day?
No, I don't think so, but it was well used, whatever. And that's a little rough piece of water across there.
What port did you land in France?
In the harbor.
In Le Havre. Yeah. So that's basically where the invasion took place.
So then, when we arrived there, the system, was still functioning. They sent us on through, and I arrived at the 95th Infantry, and John Kosminski, I went to the 45th.
Now, Kosminski, yeah. Was he your buddy that you kind of went together?
We've been together over a period of time, and that's where we were separated there.
Do you have any contact with him yet?
No, I'm not even sure he's alive. I went to see him. He lived outside of Johnstown.
Oh, another fellow Pennsylvanian.
Yeah, and I went to visit him back a few years ago, and I hadn't heard anything recently. I'm not sure.
Had you had contact after the war physically, or had you visited with him?
Yeah, we were back and forth.
Interesting.
And John was wounded. He had a slug in his shoulder, and but he survived it and went to work in the coal mines. And he lived in Billtown, which is a suburb of Johnstown. I've been there, but I couldn't tell you where it is.
And when you got to the 95th, Did they kind of like truck you up as a replacement, or?
Well, we came in to Metz, and then they trucked us to a place called Hardarton, and this was still in France. And from there I went to past that sign that you saw.
Yeah, let me. Mark has a book here on the 95th, and it shows their process and where they went through France and then into Germany, and then basically they went from France pretty much directly east to Metz, which
Yes.
is, I guess, where you met up with them.
Yes.
Which is still in France, but very near the German border,
Yeah.
which the first German town is Saarland, which is just across the border, where the 95th made their first penetration into Germany. And it was probably, it looks like, I don't know what the scale is here, but it was south of Bastogne.
Yeah. Well, he also, the 95th was given a lot of credit for taking Metz.
For taking Metz, okay,
Yeah,
yeah, it shows a big
Yeah.
splash here where that took place. And so you met up in Metz at that time, and do you know approximately what date that was or time frame?
I don't know
You-
whether it was the end of December or 1st of January, but it was around that time.
Okay, and this is December, January of 45,
No,
44.
44.
Okay, December of 44, okay, I'm getting straight now. So the landing took place, initial landing in Normandy was in June of 44.
Right,
So now we're talking about 6 months later.
yeah.
And this is when the Battle of the Bulge was taking place.
Yeah.
December, it would have been underway,
Well,
where the
yes.
Germans made their attack
I think the
and took
16th.
Bastogne.
I think the 6th of December, they never took Bastogne, but they came
It
close.
came close, yeah, well, yeah. Good point. That's where the McAuliffe and his response to the Germans nuts took place. And did you hear any of that when you were moving north from Metz
And we went by truck
by truck
to Bastogne.
to Bastogne itself?
Yeah.
And this would have been, you would have gotten there, what, February, January?
I think probably in,
It was winter,
oh yes, very much so.
a bad winter.
Yeah, I think it would have been probably towards the end of January.
Toward the end of January, so it was still good, hot and heavy there then,
It
yeah.
was
We had to
still-
push the Germans back.
Still coming, it was still, like I said, we did not draw a lot of fire, but we did have some. And we were in an area where the 6th Armored and the 26th Infantry had been. And they had taken an awful beat.
And was the British north of that then, or?
The British were in Holland, is where we.
Right, they were up north.
Yeah,
And so you kind of took that same route that if you've seen Bridge Too Far, the movie kind of figured that whole main route, and there was just one main route, as I understand it, up toward Holland. And so you proceeded with the 95th Infantry Division. And did you see any of the leftovers of the 101st Airborne who were holding the major holders of Bastogne?
Not specifically, but what I said, the area that we were into had been held by the 6th Armored and the 26th Infantry. And they had taken an awful.
Did they pull back then and you moved in with it?
They were out of there by the time we got there. We moved in right behind them.
Because the reason I ask about the 101st is that
Oh,
the
yeah.
Band of Brothers and a lot of publicity, people know a whole lot about that part of the battle and the 101st based upon the movie and the books. So anyhow, then we're talking about February, and then you continued to move more north.
We went from, we wound up in a little town called Milan, Belgium. And from there we went into Holland
Okay.
and relieved a unit of the British Second Army.
A regiment of the Second Armored, did you say?
Second Army, British Second Army.
British Second Armored.
And then we took a position there on the Moss River. And our colonel wasn't satisfied until we got into a little scrap there. And we finally crossed the river. And then we came back.
The Moss River.
Yeah. And then we came back to Belgium and got ready for the move to the Rhine.
And you crossed the Rhine at Rheinhausen?
Yeah, they hooked us up with the British, or with the Second Armored Division. Their code name is Hell on Wheels.
Yeah. It still exists.
I know. And we rode medium tanks across the river.
And
And we went through where the 17th Airborne had jumped in.
okay, and that was the last airborne operation, major airborne operation
it
of
was,
the
yeah.
Second World War, after we were moving into Germany. And I guess the engineers put up a bridge for you.
We did, yeah, sure enough.
Bailey Bridge.
Yeah.
Those who have been in the Army are familiar with the Bailey Bridges, the pontoons.
Just a big pontoon. I was glad to get over there.
And we already discussed the Remagen. You were close enough to
Yeah.
Remagen to see
To know about it.
but you didn't see the bridge itself.
It wasn't in sight.
Because it was pretty much destroyed by that time. I think it had fallen after our troops got across, which is where the first crossing took place into Germany. And then it shows a big fight here by the 95th around Dortmund and Ham.
Did I mention Soest
German.
there? On
Who is it?
Soest,
Soest, yes, that's the final destination.
that's where we found.
What we're looking at is a map here, and where you see the big red splashes, that's where we're talking about, and it's this particular one here, and that's Soest right there. Then, at what point in time were you finished in Germany?
Let me think about that. I got bumped around a little bit by a shell, and I wound up back in Reims, France, in the hospital. But what happened was, I was at the battalion aid station, and there was a captain who was checking me out, and he said, "Do you want to go back to your outfit?" I said, "Sure." So he turned away, then he turned back. I said, "You're not going." Turned out that I had jaundice. So they sent me back to Reims, France, in the hospital there. I was in there about a month. But I think 15th or 17th of April would have been about the last of the combat.
Of 45. April of 45, and the VE Day victory in Europe was, I believe, May?
Yeah, well, they signed they surrendered officially in Reims, I know that. And that would have been in, I think, in May.
May, I think. So it was like the month before the final signing of or capitulation. just a little more detail, during this time within the 95th, were you assigned to a battalion or a regiment?
Yeah, my address was Medical Detachment, 377th Infantry.
Okay. And this medical detachment supported a regiment then, 377th Regiment, I
Well,
assume?
spent most of my time with F Company, which was in the 2nd Battalion.
Of the 377th?
Yes.
So you were with the infantry unit
Oh, yes,
as a medic?
yes.
Okay, so were you involved in treating
Oh, yes, yeah.
right on
Whatever you could
the
do.
field of battle?
Yeah, you could do.
Can you recall any specific instances?
No, we had another medic who I guess I replaced him. I couldn't replace him, but I was there in his place. He was absolutely fearless, and he had a couple silver stars for his efforts. But he just did what you had to do. No, he would.
Did you had like an aid kit and all of that and
Yeah, I carried morphine and bandages and the necessary things.
And just to get into the evacuation process, like if one of the troops was wounded, you treated him, yeah, or typically in the movies you say, you hear him cry for medic, medic, and
get him on a litter and get him back if you can. And if you can't, sometimes we couldn't get to them always right away. But they had a pretty good system, and the procedure was to go back to the battalion aid station. And if they required something more serious, then it was back to the regimental aid station. And there, the next step was the field.
Depending upon how serious the wounds
The
were.
field hospital.
So they go up to a higher level facility. And as far as you working, were there like two of you medics working together with this company, F Company?
Not really. Generally, I was on my own.
On your own, and then if you had a wounded and you had to put him on a litter, did they typically load him on a Jeep then?
If they could, yes, they could get a Jeep up without getting it blown up.
And you just used one of the troops that was there to help you?
They would always help, yeah.
And did you drive the Jeep? Was it a Red Cross type?
No, they had a Jeep driver.
A Jeep driver.
And that was his responsibility.
So, and he'd evacuate him back to a field hospital.
Well, the first step would be the battalion aid station.
Battalion aid station.
And then if they said he needs more help, we'll send him on back to the regimental aid station.
Okay, that's from battalion, next level up is regimental.
And then from the next, that was into the field hospital beyond that.
We had, one of our other interviewees had been a nurse, and she worked in one of the field hospitals, however. Anyhow, and also, interestingly, just from the local area here, we had a friend, Joe Johnson, who is a medic, and
Was he?
He was involved where he just wouldn't talk about it, and Joe died probably 10 years ago or so. But anyhow, it's too bad we didn't have a chance to interview him, because I know for one thing that he had gone through Heidelberg, and I was stationed in Heidelberg at one time, so it's kind of interesting that with regard to that. But he was a very close friend, and actually lived with my wife's family, and of course went to the St. Luke's Church in Cabot, and so I'd like to just make mention of Joe, because he's passed, but but I know he was exposed a lot and the war affected him a lot.
Just basic first aid. And I got no training when I arrived at the division. They handed me a litter and said, go that way.
Just very, very basic.
Yeah.
But you learned as you went.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess, like, when they got to the doctors, some of those field units were really.
Some of those doctors were tremendous.
That's where I think we made a lot of our advancements in medicine, just from what they learned, taking care of some of the casualties they had and treating some wounds that were just unbelievable. And it's amazing just looking at where we're at today.
Yeah, they do.
Where, I mean, we have troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, that right now, the vests and everything they have, a lot of them are injured, evacuated, and they're saved, whereas in World War II, they
lost
no hope.
Yeah.
And
somebody asked me if I was hurt, and I said, not unless being scared counts.
And anyhow, these experiences compared to today, it's hard for kids today to really understand what the conditions were, as far as also your food, the rations that they have today. The helicopter was not there, just barely coming into play.
Yeah.
And so you didn't have the evacuation process. This was by jeep and then truck or whatever to eventually get evacuated. And, did you as a medic carry a rifle?
Oh, no.
Medics typically didn't carry a rifle, and typically, and I think the Germans were pretty good about not trying to shoot at medics.
Well, when I started out there in France, I had a red cross on my chest and one on my back, one on each arm and on my helmet. And
clearly identified.
Yeah, and we finally decided that was too much like a target. So we began to take them off, and I wound up at the very end of the time with just one on the helmet.
Just to identify you in case you were captured, as opposed to...
Well, when we got into Belgium, I think this was after we'd been to Holland. They trucked us into Liège, Belgium for a shower. I remember that distinctly.
After about how long a time period?
It had been a good month, maybe more than that.
Yeah, those are some real rustic times, and one of the worst winters they've ever had in that area of Europe. And do you recall, like, in your sleeping conditions, were you typically in a group tent or
a pup tent?
A pup tent.
And then when we sometimes we would get into houses. The man at the top was the one that called the shots on that. Patton, when he was in charge, he could do anything. But some of the rest of them were, he wants you to go through the town and then dig holes, you know. That didn't work too well.
When the troops were online and they were in foxholes, were you typically in a foxhole yourself, or did you?
Most times I was with somebody.
Yeah, a buddy in a foxhole.
Yeah. Food was K-rations mostly. K-ration was a little can of potted meat and some crackers and maybe a little bit of chocolate and some cigarettes. And that was it. And it wasn't, it was better than nothing.
You're apparently not a smoker now, but were you a smoker back then? I guess most everybody was, and you had it issued on airplanes and in your rations. And as far as your progression rank-wise, did you?
No, I got to be a PFC, and that was it.
You were a PFC,
Yeah.
which you got promoted to, what, after 4 months? Or?
No, that was before I got over there. Right. Before I went to France.
Yeah, 4 months after you were in. We have a picture on the wall here, a hanging with your various medals. If you don't mind, I'll take this off.
Okay, fine.
These are the medals, this being the shoulder patch for the 90 and Roman 5, 95th Infantry Division. And next down is the Combat Medic Badge, which is this badge here. This is a Bronze Star with a star on it, which means he earned it in combat. Very respectable medal. And the other, these three around here are campaigns, one for the American campaign, World War II, victory, and this is European, African, and Middle Eastern campaign. And this is a good conduct medal here. And the little guy down on the bottom here is the his discharge medal. With regard to some of the personal items while you were living rather rustically through a winter, and then spring came, and April was when you were brought back, and then from there you came back to...
I came back to the division from the hospital. Again, through the system. We arrived in Marburg, Germany, and there was a colonel who gave some information, and we had a choice of either occupation or going to the Pacific. And there was one other item which fails me, I can't think of it. So this captain stood up, and he was a 95th Infantry. And he called, said, those of us there, stand up. And would we like to get back to the outfit? We said, yeah. The next morning the trucks come in the yard and picked us up. And we got back to the company and reported in that evening. And the next morning we boarded the train to come back to La Havre, to come home.
So I know at that time there was a point system, and decisions were being made. This was prior to the dropping of the atomic bomb, and people that have finished, all the troops finishing up in Europe had a potential of then being shipped to the Pacific theater. And there was a point system, and in this case it was probably at division level where they just decided they weren't going to deploy the division. And
that happened afterwards. I came back to Norfolk, Newport News really, on the USS General Gordon. And
troop ship.
yeah. And got home. Was home for about 30 days and reported back to Fort George G. Meade. And they shipped us there, from there to Camp Shelby, Mississippi. And it was announced that we were going to be part of the invasion of Japan.
Oh, so you were brought back to the U.S. and
Yeah.
you were still the 95th Division through all of this. And
Yes.
so they were going to deploy the
The
95th.
division was going. There were 4 divisions, the 86th, which I think was on the high seas at that time, the 95th, the 97th, and the 104th. And we had begun to pack, ready to go to the West Coast when they dropped the bomb. So I was grateful.
And you were at Camp Chaffee at that time?
No, Camp Shelby,
Shelby.
yeah. And when they deactivated the division, then I was sent over to Camp Shelby, or Camp Chaffee.
That's
in
Arkansas,
Yeah.
right. So Shelby was Mississippi.
Yeah,
So
that's
you
right,
went from coming back on the troop ship through Newport News, Virginia,
Right,
and then you went to Camp Shelby, Mississippi with the 95th, all
Yeah.
the way through, and the 95th was then going to be deployed to the Pacific.
yeah.
And the bomb was dropped, and then you processed out then through,
Yeah,
did they break up the division after the bomb was
yeah,
dropped
They
in
broke up the division,
Japan?
deactivated it.
Deactivated division? And then, did they discharge you
No,
there?
I had points, but when I got to Arkansas, they couldn't process fast enough, so they sent me home. And I was home about 10 days, and then I came back and was discharged.
Huh. So you came home to Maryland
Yeah,
and then went back after 10 days leave,
yeah,
and they discharged you out of
still out of Camp.
Camp Chaffee, Arkansas.
Yeah,
And you went back and forth by train, I assume?
well, if the train wasn't on strike, to get you on a bus. But there was a little difficulty with that,
Oh, is that right?
yeah.
The railroaders were striking at that time.
Yeah, I think I remember, there was 2 or 3 of us, and we were gonna come up to St. Louis. And we got to St. Louis, and the railroads are on strike. So they put us on a bus, and we come back through Pittsburgh, and on down to Maryland.
Getting back overseas, and
Yes.
talking a little bit about your contact with home, like how often you could send letters and how often you got letters and people that you kept in contact with and
I
any
think it
affiliation with your church.
It was very good, I would say. I wrote pretty regularly, and my mother wrote regularly, and my wife-to-be wrote regularly. So I can't complain about that.
And so had you had known your wife to
Yes.
be before you left for the service?
Yes, yeah.
Were you like in high school together or?
No, she was from Wilkinsburg, and she was visiting down there when we met, and then we just made contact, and we continued to write to each other. And I came home in November of '45, and we were married in July of '46.
Good. And life after that,
Well, we lived for 10 years in Grantsville area, and then we moved to Michigan. I was out there more than 50 years.
50 years in Michigan, so you became a regular Michigander.
Yeah.
And where in Michigan was that?
I moved here from Jackson, Michigan.
Jackson, and is that where you spent most of those 50 years?
No, that was the last 30, about 30 years there. And before that, was mostly around the Detroit area. We lived in Beverly Hills for a long time.
And what did you do work-wise?
We were a distributor for heavy-duty truck parts. And we had a warehouse operation and a couple of branches.
Is that something you worked for an extended period of time and then
Yes.
retired from?
Yes, yeah.
Back when Detroit was a going town.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
it's nothing now.
yeah, the business has gone way down. And now we're in Cabot, Pennsylvania at Concordia facility.
Right?
And we're in the apartment in the Concordia facility right now. And can you tell us a little bit about how and why you got here?
Back in 2004, my wife and I decided we should find someplace. And we did a lot of looking and found out through our niece that this place existed. And we came here and made application. And then lost my wife in 2008.
2008.
So I contacted
Sorry.
people here and asked them if my application was still valid, and they said it was, so I came here in June of 2010.
2010. So you had kind of 2 years after your wife had passed away out in Michigan yet. And
Yeah.
do you have relatives out there?
No.
Do you have relatives back in Maryland?
Yeah, I still have a sister in there.
A sister in Maryland, and you visit regularly?
Somewhat,
Still?
yeah.
As far as anything you brought home with you from the war, did you?
No, I
were you able to?
had a few things, but when I went to the hospital, that was taken over with the Red Cross. I finally got the container, but there wasn't much in it.
So this is when you were evacuated to the hospital,
Yeah.
just before the night you rejoined the 95th.
Yeah, well, I was home for some time before this container arrived from the Red Cross.
And did you have a home church that you
Yes,
regularly
yeah.
attended?
Yeah.
That,
St. John Reformed Church.
and you had contact with them during
Yes.
the time you were overseas?
Yeah.
And we already talked about your buddy John.
Yeah.
Are there buddies, other friends that you kept in contact with that were in the military with you?
Not in particular. After I discovered they were having reunions, I attended a number. We attended a number of them,
Oh, good.
and got back in touch with
And that was with the 95th Division.
Yeah.
And where were these reunions typically held?
Could be anywhere. When they had a number of people attending, they would there would always be a business meeting on Saturday, and they would throw it open for someone to speak up and say their town. They'd have to have information about it, and then there'd be a vote, and they would vote to go wherever it was. There was the last one I understand was in Boston. I didn't attend. And I understand there's going to be one in New Orleans this year.
Planning to go?
No.
I think it'd be neat if, because there aren't too many of you around anymore.
No,
And so,
I haven't given up
Probably.
entirely with the present time.
yeah, sure, it'd be nice to help you make it happen.
Yeah.
Did you get down to the World War II Memorial?
Yes, I did. Yeah. Back in 2007, a fellow by the name of Cameron in Royal Oak, Michigan, And I got that started. And they called it the honor flight. And
And that's still going strong.
I guess it is, but anyway, they gathered up about 80 of us. And on a given time, we had to report to Woodward Avenue and 13 Mile Road in Royal Oak at 3 o'clock in the morning. So we got there, and they handed us a lanyard to identify yourself. And we boarded buses. There was about 80 of us. And they had some guardians, as they called it. And they bused us to the airport, Metropolitan Airport, outside of Detroit. And they put us through security and then gave us breakfast. And then we boarded commercial flights and flew into Washington. And we went first to the memorial by bus, of course, again.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were there for, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 hours because we had lunch there. And then we went to the Tomb of the Unknown and Iwo Jima, Korea, I think. And I think the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
Came back to the airport and boarded the planes and came out.
All on the same day?
Same day.
That was a long day. What time did you get home?
We got home about 10 o'clock that night.
10 o'clock, 3 a.m. until 10? And this would have been in
2007.
7. Yeah. My wife and I were actually had the privilege of attending the dedication of the memorial.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah. We lived in Arlington, which is right nearby,
Yeah, sure.
so it was close to us, and I worked downtown. And during the whole week preceding the dedication, they had tents set up and a lot of displays with they had Jeeps from the old Bantam that they had in that was invented in Butler here,
Mm-hmm.
the first Jeep, and then the whole series of various makers of the Jeeps, and they had a lot of the old equipment from World War II. And probably the most interesting part was they had a tent set up and breakdown by division. So with your 95th Division, they would have had a booth there, and anybody who was in the 95th could report in there and see who they might know, etc. In addition to that, the people they had a whole squad of people from the Library of Congress that there were World War II vets all over the place. And these volunteers came in and would interview the vets and get a whole spectrum of all the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine, and they now have the documentation of that in the Library of Congress someplace. I don't know what the disposal of it was, but it was really kind of moving to go out on the mall in DC and see all of this happening. And it was going on for like a week before the dedication, and the dedication itself was...
That'd be fantastic, I would think.
Yeah, it was
Now,
very
the
moving.
day we were there, Bob Dole was there.
Yeah.
We talked to him.
Oh, is that right?
And
on the day you were there?
And he, I feel he's responsible for making it
Got
happen.
a lot of that
I
happening.
don't think I would think it would have happened without him.
And are you registered in the World War II Memorial Registry? Do you know?
I don't know.
If not, I will check and I can get you registered. All I
Okay.
need is some information regarding your unit and time you were in, etc.
Okay,
And we can also get a picture put in.
okay,
So if you have one of your old military pictures,
I've got one.
good. We'll select one of those and we'll get you registered.
Okay,
Coming up to today, the 7th of July, 2011, looking back, are there any remembrances or things that really jump out that you'd like to mention for
well,
posterity?
the people that I stayed with in England. Uh, Unfortunately, I had an address book that went to the Red Cross, and that got lost, and I never could even write them and say thank you. I felt very bad about that.
Well, that's too bad.
Because they were very nice to me.
I'm sure the English would appreciate hearing that, because that was a big load on England, not only being attacked at that time, trying to protect themselves, but having all the U.S. troops coming in, and it was a time that was big turmoil for England, and of course they were getting ready for the invasion also, and a very heavy part of it. So I think it's very good, and it's very worthwhile to recognize the British for their whole play in this.
Like I said, I admire them. They're terrific people.
And what do you think about today's military?
I don't know if I should publish this or not, but I feel sorry for them. You know,
Yeah,
tie one hand,
a lot of deployments.
tie one hand behind you and now go get this guy. See?
Yeah. That and the number of deployments. I mean, trying.
Spreading
It's a
thin.
different world. Different.
I don't think you know who the enemy is.
You know, in
But half
most
the
cases,
time,
yeah. Terrorists
We
define that.
knew where they were, you know. Dry feed is important. When I was handed that letter there in France or Germany, this old sergeant called me over and he said, I'm going to give you some advice. And he said, I know you didn't ask for it, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. What's
Typical
that?
sergeant.
He handed me a pair of socks. He said, you put those socks on top of your head. And he said, when you go to bed at night, no matter where you are, you put those socks on. And put the ones you have on your feet on top of your head. And that's what he did, and I had a bit of foot trouble. Not any.
It was like magic.
It was.
Because dry socks mean
never forgot
everything. We have lived a little bit. We changed tapes, and during the interim, we were talking a little bit about living conditions on a day-to-day basis. When you're living out of putt tents, it's the middle of winter, or it's pouring rain and sloppy, and just a big mess. Just to survive means a whole lot, and this type of thing, like dry socks, are all important. A creature comfort that you can really appreciate after, as Mark was saying, and you might mention some of the medical treatment you had for frostbite.
There wasn't much that we could do for them. They had, except send them back, because if their toes were froze, their feet were partially froze. There wasn't anything we could do. They had to get back where it was warm.
So you medevac them to?
Chain them, send them back on a Jeep or any way at all. You know.
Yeah.
Some of them could walk, still walk, you know, but you couldn't. It wasn't safe for them to be up there.
Yeah, a lot of them were amputees then, amputation of toes and.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure they did. We didn't see any of that, but I know it happened afterwards if they were too long.
But it's just the littlest things that in a combat situation like that you really can't appreciate.
Yeah.
Like the sergeant telling Mark,
Yeah.
put your socks on your head. Sleeping in sleeping bags, you often talk about,
Yeah.
you know, doubling up in the cold of winter, and two of you with your feet under each other's armpits.
Any way to keep warm.
Any way to keep warm, that's right. You know, that became your bathtub in a lot of cases.
that served a lot of purpose, a lot of,
Heat water in it,
Sure.
and so forth, the steel pot.
yeah,
That's where you had your red cross on the helmet,
yeah.
and you had a helmet liner for it, right?
Oh, yes,
A big
sure.
steel pot. And that served many, many purposes, including safety.
We had a colonel who was our battalion commander that you better not let him catch you without your,
Steel pot on,
without your helmet. We
gotta stay in uniform.
call him Iron Hat, but not to his face, of course.
But again, it's military
It
back
served
in
his purpose.
World War II. Well, Mark, just representing whomever I can represent, we thank you for your service and appreciate everything you did. Mark, could you tell us your experience and what you saw?
Well, it's what I saw was, there's no reason to treat people like that, prisoners or not. And then when we got to Soest, there was a prison camp there, mostly French officers, and we released them too, of course. And we had to watch the prisoners because if they had a chance to harm their guards, they would. So,
This is if we captured prisoners or we took over a German.
when we released them from the prison camp, the prisoners themselves would try to destroy what were their guards at that time.
So upon capture, then they were sent back to a holding facility.
Yes, we sent them all back to the rear as quickly as we could.
And as we discussed, some of them ended up back in the US of A,
Yeah.
working on farms at wherever they were placed until the end of the war. And as far as any of the Jewish concentration camps, did you come across any of those or have any?
We saw one, I think you saw it in the journal, and I can't tell you the name of the town. But it was